Greetings, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started with our chapters 19, 20, and 21. So we're examining the Tappan textbook again, and we're looking at the basic quantitative analysis. So when we're doing any type of analysis, it's important to kind of set your stance as far as asking those questions. What do you want to gain when you're looking at the data that was presented? So some things to start thinking about, and these are kind of general questions, but was the project a success? Did one achieve the outcome that was expected? And even if the outcome that was expected wasn't achieved, it may have still been a success to indicate that maybe that was a false or not accurate goal. So the definition of success can go either way, and when we're looking at articles, very often we only see those that are considered a success, that answer the question and actually focus on where the researcher wanted to go, when in actuality the data is just as valuable if it discredits whatever the aim may have been, because that adds to the body of knowledge whether that indeed was a good or a valid concern or thought. So with that being said, were outcomes improved based on the intervention or the methodology that was done? Why or why not? Was the relationship proposed in the hypothesis correct? Yes or no? And maybe it may be inconclusive. So again, that's another method to inform future research. So if the results were not expected, what did it tell us? What direction do we need to go into next? And are the findings congruent with the body of knowledge? Is this affirming some of the information that's already out there, or is it adding more questions to indicate that further research really needs to be completed? Oops, got carried away here. So when we're looking at the data, it's really important to have the highest quality data. Cannot be emphasized enough. So when you're looking at the database, do the results make sense? When you're looking at using SPSS or those types of things, were there symbols that in the spreadsheets or in the results that indicate errors, like the hashtags, those types of things? So those are factors to really dive into when you're actually doing the analysis process, to make sure that the data is extremely accurate and consistent. So making sure that all the scoring was done correctly, that everything was coded correctly in the data set, and were there any missing factors within the data set that may alter the results. So really take a look at your textbook about the quality of data, because this is a really important concept to really embrace and understand. So when we're looking at, once we get our data and put it into some kind of structure to display, it's important that you choose the most clear method to display the data. And sometimes the most appropriate is bar charts, sometimes pie charts, sometimes scatter plots. It really depends on the data and your audience. There's so many factors to think about in how you want to display your data. And the most important thing is that it's very clear to the reader so that they can fully comprehend the information that's included in the study. So when we're diving into basic statistics, and I know you've been doing the Udacity tutorials, so with the basic descriptive statistics, we're looking at central tendency. Very simply, mean is an average, median is the middle score, and mode is the value that occurs most often. So kind of keep those things in mind, and all of those factors and all those terms are important to remember as you're looking at the research. So we're also looking at association. So relationships between two variables are very often studied, and the Pearson correlation coefficient is probably the most common. And And these are the numbers to remember. So a very strong correlation is usually 0.9 to 1. And little or no correlation is 0.0 to 0.1. So keep that in mind. You'll be seeing this in the research that you are examining. So keep that what is considered the most appropriate, or what we want to see to show that the research is indeed valuable to you. So also, when reading research, know those key terms and refer back to your textbook. It's really important to know what these terms mean. So statistical significance is something that you will see quite often, and it's the probability that differences are found based on errors, not the treatment. So if there's errors in the study, then our p-values aren't good. So we want a very low p-value, so that indicates that the result was likely not due to an error. So we want to make sure that our studies are done well and that there's not errors, so our p-value helps to define that. So typically accepted p-values range from 1% to 5%. Our p-value 0.01 to 0.05. So keep that in mind, and those are the key p-values to think about, and you want them to be low, because that's the low possibility of error. That's what we want to look for. The research hypothesis is kind of the declarative statement, what is foreseen as the result of this of a research. Null hypothesis is the predicted hypothesis wasn't found, and it was just by chance or not statistically significant. So the hypothesis wasn't proven because we don't have the data to support that. Confidence interval is something else that you need to remember, and it's the range in which the true information lies. So much like like a margin of error, so we want a very narrow confidence interval. So the narrower the confidence interval, the greater the accuracy. So if a confidence interval is, say the results are 3, and the confidence interval is 2.75 to 3.25, that's a relatively narrow confidence interval. But if our results were 3 and our confidence interval was 0 to 22, that's a very wide confidence interval, and we don't want that because it doesn't show that there's a whole lot of accuracy if our results were 3. So there's a variance that could occur on either side that shows the lack of accuracy. So variance is how much the numbers are spread out. The variable is a characteristic that varies from one person or one subject to another, and the independent variable is that treatment, that intervention, that manipulation that goes on, and the dependent variables are the measured outcomes from that, whether it be treatment, intervention, or manipulation. So kind of keep those in mind and kind of mull through those, because again, this is really fundamental as far as knowing what these terms mean. So when we're looking at inferential analysis, we're looking at analysis of variance. So we're looking at those ANOVAs and t-tests, and there are a number of different versions of ANOVA and regression analysis, etc. So make sure you take a look at your textbook and kind of familiarize yourself with those factors as well. So when we're looking at qualitative data analysis, so there are different types, and the focus of the type depends on the data. So we're looking at either structured or semi or unstructured. So when we're looking at structured, we're coding and we're quantifying that qualitative data, which seems maybe a little off, but you can quantify some qualitative data. And then we're looking at semi-structured or unstructured, that coding that determines themes in a very simplistic way. So some general tips when we're doing qualitative data, it's kind of the same theme. Make sure the data is really organized, prepare those transcripts. So instead of numbers, we're looking at transcripts, we're looking at words typically, and make sure that the data is very accurately uploaded for analysis. Again, the same principle holds true. The information that you have is only as good as what you enter in and analyze. So overall, the goal of most qualitative study is to really gain that rich insight and elevating the levels of abstraction. So we're going beyond those concrete numbers, yes, no type responses, and looking at those meaning type issues. And very often qualitative research is done before quantitative to kind of get those general themes so that it can be driven down using quantitative analysis in the future. So when we're looking at qualitative coding, descriptive is the most concrete level. It's dividing the information into categories. Interpretive kind of elevates the abstract, and that's based on the reader's comprehension of the content. So the researcher really analyzes the content of the transcripts or the data, the interviews, and really dives into their comprehension based on their expertise and knowledge. And then pattern is a higher level of abstraction. So it is that the researcher actually connects between patterns or meaning. So we're looking at different levels of abstraction when we're looking at qualitative analysis. So when we're looking at content level, we're looking at the narrative and those shared experiences. That's one way to look at it. And then there's also discourse within content analysis. And that's really focused on the language, the linguistic focus. And then when looking at analyzing the text, there's a couple of different methods and thoughts. One is to answer those well-constructed research questions. What are you finding in the text that relates to that question? The other is identifying those themes and expressions of meaning. And sometimes we want to examine the effect of a particular question. And your book has an example of questions posed to those with Alzheimer's. So how do they react to those questions? Something like, how many times has your daughter visited is much different than how do you feel about your daughter's visits, those types of things. So notice the nuance that we're not looking at quantifying, we're looking at meaning. So when we dive into analysis in the very broad spectrum, and I want you to read through each of these sections, but ethnographic, we're looking at gaining insight regarding culture. So remember that ethnographic cultures. Grounded theory is concerned more with those social and psychological factors of health, and phenomenological, that's a mouthful, analysis is really focusing on the individual's experience in the context of that experience. And very often we can dive into what it's like to have a particular diagnosis or a particular experience. So those really add some insight into caring for those folks. And typically they're grounded in some sort of theory as well to kind of guide the analysis. So, in tying the three chapters together, always focus on clarity when displaying the data, whether it would be qualitative or quantitative. Know the statistical terms and the terms of doing the studies as you critique